Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this McKell Institute in Conversation series as part of our digital event series that we've initiated over the course of the associated lockdowns and pandemics. When we couldn't leave our houses and go out and do interesting things, we tried to bring some interesting things to you. Obviously, we're very fortunate today to have Sean Kelly join us to talk about his new book, which I'll talk a little bit more in a moment. But we really appreciate the time that you've taken to join us here today, even though in Melbourne and Sydney, at least in other parts of the country, we're not in lockdown anymore. We can go out and leave, but it's a good way to spend some of the habits we've picked up about being able to talk about interesting things at our desks during lunchtime. Hopefully we can take with us as we emerge back to normal life again. Before we begin today, can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we're all meeting on? I come to you today from Wurundjeri country in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to acknowledge and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians who are joining us here today. For those of you who I don't know, who haven't joined us on a McKell Institute webinar before, my name is Ryan Batchelor. I'm the Executive Director of the McKell Institute in Victoria, and obviously with my colleagues in Sydney and Brisbane and Adelaide as part of the network of McKell Institute offices. We're trying to bring you, our members and our supporters, some interesting conversations about contemporary politics and policy. And as I said, we're grateful to be joined today by Sean Kelly to discuss his new book, The Game, a portrait of Scott Morrison, which I've got here. It hit bookstores Monday. Is it Monday? Sure.
Theoretically, it hit them Monday, but COVID has brought disruptions to mail everywhere, it turns out.
Global supply chains being what they are, domestic supply chains being what they are. But hopefully, if you haven't got out and pre-ordered or bought your copy yet, please make sure you do so. I had the privilege of getting an early look at the book, and it's fantastic, and I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have here today. I might just briefly introduce Sean, and then we'll get started. Many of you will be familiar with Sean Kelly as a writer and commentator. He's obviously got a regular column in the Age and Sydney Morning Herald, which is a must-read for followers of politics. Many of you will know that Sean was a political advisor to the previous Labor government, working with both Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, and that's where our paths cross for a very long period of time, it seems. We both served that government in its various incarnations and iterations through the ups and the downs and the bits in between. So for me, I'm really excited about the opportunity to talk to Sean about this book, about his journey in doing it, and then some reflections on politics and prime ministers that we've both seen up close and that we're now watching from afar. So thanks very much, Sean. One of the things that struck me in reading the book, many of us on the call today will have consumed quite a lot of political biographies in our time. It's not a straightforward it's not your normal political biography. You're not going to pick up this book and understand who Scott Morrison was as a child and go through a chronology to today. Can you talk a little bit in introduction just about how you approached the task of writing a book about the Prime Minister, and why you adopted a slightly different approach, and maybe explain that to those who haven't had the opportunity to read it?
It was a slightly odd process because I was asked to write a long article about Scott Morrison in 2018, and I got everything I could on him. I read everything there was that I could find about him. I talked to as many people as would talk to me within the time available. And I stared at these facts, and I stared at them for a long time, and I couldn't figure out what to write because there just aren't obvious threads in Morrison's life. What has he done? Nothing very clear. What does he believe? One of the most important things about a politician, nothing very clear. And I don't mean that just in a critical, pejorative sense. I mean, when you look very closely at everything he's said over a very long period of time, his speech is very vague. When it is sharp, he tends to contradict himself elsewhere. And finally, I had this moment when I realized that was the defining thread of Scott Morrison's political career, that there wasn't really anything defined, that it was a series of vaguenesses. So I wrote that article, and you never know when you write an early analysis of a political leader whether it will stand up. And so it's a little bit nerve-wracking. And I was surprised over the coming of years to see how much he stuck to the model he developed before he became Prime Minister, of never really saying anything clear, not really trying to do anything. And so then I was asked to write this book, and I said no at first. I wasn't really that interested in Scott Morrison, or at least I couldn't find more to be interested in than I'd already written that first time. And then I realized a similar thing, that this boredom that I felt about Scott Morrison, that many people I know felt about Scott Morrison, was one of the keys. You know, why did he bore us all? Why weren't we more interested in him? And so part of what I then did in trying to approach this book is work out what it was about Scott Morrison that bored us. So that's one aspect of it, that I tried to analyze, I guess, the image that he's created and exactly what that image does to us and why we accept it or don't accept it at various points in time. And then the other thing I did, and this was a little bit there in the first article, but it's there much more now, is because he's done so little, unlike most leaders, you have to look incredibly closely at what he says. I think with most leaders, they say lots of things, but ultimately you judge their political career, certainly a prime ministership, on their achievements or lack of achievements. And with Morrison, because it's hard to land on those things that he has proactively done or chosen to do, you have to look very closely at his words. And what that lends itself to, I think, is a very Morrisonian thing, which is to look at his performance. He is essentially creating this character and this performer as this performer. And so the book ended up being far more of an analysis of how he's done that than a straight biography. Biographies, of course, are very valuable. There are a couple of very strong books out there about Scott Morrison, but personally, I was interested in doing something quite different.
Yeah, it's that difference is, I think, what makes it so appealing to those of us who are really trying to understand who our Prime Minister is. Because I think, as you say, he came to the job unexpectedly in some respects, and he won unexpectedly in 2019.
I mean, fortunately for me, there has been this process, I think, in the population that has mirrored my transition, if you like. I started off bored with Morrison and now find him quite fascinating. And when I first started this book, people would say to me, why on earth are you spending all that time with this man? And at this point, not just this week, which has been interesting in itself, but more broadly, people are saying, oh, actually, who is this bloke? He's this oddly enigmatic figure. People don't really understand what makes him tick. So I think I'm quite fortunate that the book's coming out at a point when people are interested in him again.
Absolutely. I've got my first question, my first note really is if you could talk a bit about, and I've got written here, Scomo as persona, that he's really, we don't know him, he's had to construct an image. And there are a couple of chapters in the book where you really do quite good analysis on how he went about constructing this image that he now presents to us. It was a very deliberate strategy. Can you talk a little bit about the construction of Scomo? Those critical things that you found were really important to him.
Yeah.
Why he did it and how he did it.
I think you have to look at Scott Morrison's public life in two phases. There's a phase up to about 2015. And in the phase up to 2015, he essentially keeps himself as a blank slate. He doesn't answer questions. He doesn't like talking about himself. And then it's kind of filled in for him a little bit when he becomes immigration minister, and he starts to appear as this very hardline type bloke. And he does a couple of pretty distasteful things as shadow immigration minister and as immigration minister. And they risk filling him in forevermore and painting him as this particular person. So in 2015, what he starts to do is make use of the thing that is still largely a blank slate, and he starts to fill it in with elements of his own choosing. And so he appears on Annabelle Crabb's kitchen cabinet and he cooks a curry. And this is a new habit, he says. He now cooks a curry once a week. So there's this very simple image, very simple fact. He cooks, but not very often. He's modern, but not too modern. He starts to talk about rugby league quite a lot. Starts to tweet about it again after an absence of some time. Starts to tweet about eating at restaurants with cuisine from all over the world. There's this clear effort to establish himself or to shift from this masculine hardline guy to this more traditionally gentle, more traditionally feminine type guy, but not that feminine. And it's, it's rooted in very old values, I think, a very old way of looking at the world, but he is creating this character for us. And really, those are the only things we learn about him. When he goes to that election in 2019, there is very little else we know, and that is incredibly deliberate. As soon as he becomes prime minister, he starts doing these things which are incredibly contrived. His social media team put out a montage video of him saying "Go Sharks" 20 times. He gives his first TV interview as prime minister, not to Lee Sales, but to a rugby league star. He has a press conference in that first week of his prime ministership holding a rugby league ball. So it's not the occasional accidental reference to rugby league. It's a very deliberate, strategic PR exercise. And the result going into that election is that we have no idea who Scott Morrison is, but we have a very clear idea who Scomo is. And that Scomo avatar is a phrase that some people have used. That Scomo avatar stands in for the real Scott Morrison. And that's the guy who wins the election.
Well, it certainly proved very successful for him in 2019. And I want to come back to that in a little bit, because I think it's in thinking forward to 2022, which is what I think that the election is going to be, understanding how that works and how much the country is getting a read on Scott Morrison will change the dynamics of the next election. I want to come back to. I should just mention before I go on, please, people have submitted some questions and some of them are fantastic, and I'll get to them in a minute. Prior to the discussion today, if you've got any further questions, please make use of the Q&A function so we can ask Sean some of the things that you want to hear from him. In addition to him clearly being a performer, and it's been a big part of his life since he was a kid, performance. He was there's fabled stories of the child actor appearing in commercials, and it's clearly come through, as you've mentioned, in the creation of his latest incarnation of his personality of Scomo. The other things that strike me as things you really tease out well in the first part of the book about Scott Morrison. I mean, the book's divided into three parts. Largely, I think it was three parts: a man, a country, a time. And that bit in the front about how he goes about engaging in politics with the press and politics with the community through the press. There are some really lengthy quotes from his transcript of his press conferences, which is a really useful tool that you use in the book to remind us exactly what it's like. One of the things that struck me is the extent of obfuscation that seems to be ever present in the way he communicates with people. That if his job is as the nation's leading communicator, he doesn't like doing that on a lot of topics a lot of time. Can you talk to us a little bit about your observations about how he likes to communicate?
I mean, this is part of the blank slate up to 2015. He became incredibly good at not answering any questions. I mean, you think back to the famous fact that he invented this protocol of on-water matters, and he wouldn't answer anything about on-water matters. And, as the immigration minister, answering questions, I know this is obvious, but it's worth saying, answering questions about boats arriving on the water, it means they were suddenly off limits. I mean, this is insanity. And, you had doyens at the press gallery like Laurie Oakes and David Marr saying very clearly, like, this is a new level of contempt for the press. And it was. What's interesting, though, is I think it comes from an awareness, and all politicians have this, but I think they often forget an incredible awareness on Morrison's part of the power of the press. So while I don't think he'd put it in these terms, the argument I make is that he creates this character. And in some ways it's a fictional character. It has some resemblance to reality, but in some ways it's a fictional character. It's not that different to the way we'd read about a character in a novel. And he understands that journalists are essentially the author of that novel. And so he's very aware of their power. And this goes back right back to the start of his career, when he's in his 20s and answering questions about tourism. he is incredibly guarded. And then when he's in New Zealand and he's 30 years old, and he's asked in the first profile of him that's ever done what his age is, and he says in his 30s, and that's as specific as he'll get. And he obviously wants people to think of him as older than he is, but the point there is the habit. He does not want to give people any information that can be used to put anything specific to him. It's incredibly how consistent this habit is. And so then when he starts finally providing information about this Scomo character, it's in some ways it seems like the opposite. He's providing lots of information, but really it's the same habit. It's a recognition of the power of journalists to tell his story, of his desperate dependence on journalists to tell his story. And then I think you see the third chapter of that, if you like, is in the parts of his prime ministership when he comes under pressure, because then journalists start to challenge him. It happens particularly around the time of the crisis around sexual violence and gender inequity. And he starts to really lash back, really get very defensive at journalists, attempt to intimidate them in certain ways. And it's horrible to watch. But I think it comes from a similar impulse, which is he likes to be powerful, and he's quite used to having used the press, influenced the press, manipulated the press very successfully. And then when they kind of rear up and start to challenge him, he understands in some deep inner part of himself how threatening that is. And like a lot of people, when they feel some element of vulnerability, he lashes back. You know, he goes, he gets quite aggressive in those moments.
There is a viciousness about how he responds to those kind of threats.
There is. I mean, it remains a really incredible moment during the entire Brittany Higgins phase of his prime ministership, if you like, when he's asked at a press conference about the latest round of allegations about awful behaviour at Parliament House, and he delivers quite an emotive, a statement which sounds very sincere. I think probably was sincere, but then he starts to raise rumours about various people in the press gallery, as though he were threatening the press gallery with the airing of their dirty laundry if they happened to report on these types of things around his government. Now that's an extraordinary threat for a prime minister to make. I mean, it's really quite a horrible moment.
It's also, in some respects, a preview to the behaviour we saw this week, where leaking is not the right word. The disclosure of text messages from Emmanuel Macron to
that's right.
to Scott Morrison as refutation of Macron's comments that he was lied to, I think, is another instance in that pattern of behaviour where that lashing out.
Yeah, and there are two elements there, right? There's firstly the element of if Scott Morrison is attacked, he backgrounds the media. So he doesn't necessarily say something openly. He goes through back channels, if you like. He makes sure information gets out there, but it's never clearly tied to him. So it's this very subterranean way of operating, which is clearly in keeping with his general tendency towards secrecy, accountability, and not wanting to be seen to be at the centre of things. And then the second element is that it does come when he's under pressure and when he's being threatened. And, you know, that is not a politically smart thing to do. I think it does suggest a brittleness when he's under pressure, and it creates trouble for him. It created trouble for him during the bushfires. It created trouble for him in the Women's March for Justice time, and it's creating troubles again now. He gets into one element of trouble, and that has to be managed in some way. And the way that he manages it consistently is kind of by lashing out or overbalancing, and it means that problems that are this large become this large.
One of the other things that strikes me in how he talks in his press conferences is that there's often, when there's trouble brewing or an issue, that he switches very quickly to a very passive voice, that he's an observer of political events. And it struck me this week about the text message thing, but I think you can apply it more generally. He sort of said claims were made and claims were refuted. And it's almost like he's a detached observer, passively watching what's going on rather than being the ultimate protagonist or antagonist in the story. And the positioning of him as a character that's not actually part of the political fray, but someone who's just commenting on it. I think that's a kind of interesting an attempt. Do you think he can continue to do you think he can continue to do that? Do you think that the gallery, the journalists will continue to give him the kind of leeway that they've given him in the past as these continual things happen?
Look, it's a very good question. You're right to point to it. Again, it's consistent there in his career. When he came up with that on water protocol, he started using it, and then he would shift to saying to people, well, there's this protocol. We can't break this protocol. There's this protocol in place, as if he'd had nothing to do with putting the protocol in place, as though he weren't the minister and couldn't just change it with a click of his fingers at any point. And that is consistently the thing. There was an early draft of the book, and I ended up cutting these bits for various reasons. But I drew on a guy called Mark Fisher and described Morrison as it's a little bit like calling a call center, and the call center operator says, "Oh, those are the rules, sir." And that is often the experience of dealing with Scott Morrison, I think. Will he continue to get away with it? I mean, I think one of the real difficulties for Scott Morrison's prime ministership is that having created this thin character, that was enough to get him through the 2019 election, 100%. I mean, obviously, the history tells the story. But what happens since then, I think, is a little bit of that thin character wearing even thinner, and to extend the metaphor a little too much, holes starting to appear in it as it becomes threadbare. And I think that is the problem. If you create a thin character, eventually the round character, the more nuanced aspects, the real person, if you like, is going to begin to show through. And so, no, I don't think it can last forever. I think it's come under enormous pressure at moments of crisis. I think, in a way, though, and I know we'll come back to this, but the next election will really be the pressure point here, in that the moments when Morrison's lack of accountability becomes a problem for him is moments of crisis. Outside of those moments, it's not that much of an issue. And I think the fact that people are so exhausted by the various crises of the past few years might mean that there is even less appetite than there has been at some points in the past to interrogate him further.
I think one of the things that struck me, and it comes I think part of your analysis in the book, that one of his successes, or the ingredients to his success in 2019, was that he was offering simplicity in a world of complexity, and particularly in a contest where he was the simple solution compared to a complex solution, which was essentially where Bill Shorten and Labor were in 2019 with their suite of comprehensive detailed program versus a guy who likes the sharks and cooks curry, right? Like, that was he was offering a simple choice, and people opted for simplicity. Do you think that, and there's a corollary a little bit of the thinness of his persona, do you think that that a simple agenda will be enough in the future?
For parties in general?
Yeah, or for Morrison himself. I'm particularly interested in Morrison. Like, do you think that the kind of simplicity of what he's trying to articulate and achieve will be enough for him?
I mean, simplicity almost doesn't begin to describe what he's putting forward. It is a beginning, but really what he puts forward is nothing at all. Really what he puts forward is the promise of zero change, no need to change. Everything is fine as it is. Everything will stay as it is. And I will guarantee you that it will stay the same way that it is. So I think that promise, that simplicity, is incredibly persuasive for many people. It's an incredibly soothing message, even if on a logical, intellectual level you might combat it. It doesn't mean that you're not emotionally susceptible to it. And I think that is true of many Australians. This is a very easy country to live in for many people, not for everybody, but for many people. It's a rich country. It's a peaceful country. It has incredible healthcare, which is obviously a very important thing. And so, that message that nothing has to change is very comforting. Where that becomes difficult, almost obviously, is when there is an appetite for change. And there is an appetite for change, I think, probably at two consistent points in history. One where there are obvious problems, and then the second is where there aren't obvious problems. The country is, in a sense, complacent, but there is almost a boredom with the current situation, which I think is effectively what happened in 2007. There wasn't immense frustration with where the country was. There was a boredom, and perversely, that complacency, I think, allowed a change of government in certain ways. Plus, John Howard gave people reason to be angry. The virtue of Scott Morrison's simplicity, Ryan, I think, is that he doesn't give people a reason to be angry. So people might be disappointed in him. I reckon a lot of Australians, a lot of Liberal voters don't particularly like or respect him, but it doesn't mean they're furious with him. And that's, anger is an important ingredient when people change governments.
I think that's very true. Related to that, and there's chapters about sort of the authentic, creating this authentic version of himself, but also about he likes to talk about his pragmatism and that he just, he's willing to do what needs to be done, blah, blah, blah. Do you think, what have you seen that tells us what he might actually believe in or want to do? One of the things that strikes me, and I said this I had a conversation with Annika Smethurst about her book on her biography of Morrison, and I put the question to her, and I'll put it to you. What do you think he wants to do as Prime Minister? Like, what does he actually believe in?
I don't know what Annika said. I'd love to know after this, but I genuinely don't think anything.
That's what she said.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I genuinely don't think he has anything he wants to do. And that is part of the reason that his message, however politically calculated it is, does work for him, because it is also coming from a genuine place. And that is often the case with Scott Morrison. He's very confected. He's very contrived in his public performance and his political messaging, incredibly calculated, relies on polls an enormous amount. But he's also often performing some version of himself. He's exaggerating, very deliberately exaggerating the things that there is some truth in. So, he hasn't always loved rugby league. He certainly hasn't always loved cooking. But is there some level at which his sensibility is that of an ordinary suburban, white middle-aged Australian bloke? 100% there is. And similarly with the wanting to do nothing. I think he genuinely believes that Australia is perfect as it is. And the moments where he doesn't seem related to change. So in Malcolm Turnbull's memoir, he talks about Scott Morrison being surprised at his electorate voting for gay marriage. And I think he quotes Morrison as saying something like, that this country isn't what I thought it was. And so I think there is a sense there of change being the thing that he really doesn't like.
I think that really comes across, particularly in those parts of the book where you talk about Morrison as the leader of Australia, and that his goal is to ignore our discomfort with things, or with certain people's discomfort with the inequality that they face, or the injustice that they witness, or things that essentially many in the community find could be changed. He basically says, you don't have to worry about that, just ignore it, and make everyone sort of feel happy and vindicated that they're sort of ordinary, and that's good, and that's good enough, and that's what we should all be happy with. What's interesting though is, and this is a bit of a broader and wider piece of speculation, that often I think what we've seen in Australian political discourse and in Australian political history is when leaders have gained their most respect, when they've taken moments to overcome that that tendency to keep things the way they are, and to acknowledge, whether it's acknowledging injustice of the past and initiating the apology or acknowledging that, you know, in the marriage equality debate, that things can move quite rapidly, and then the Australian community, the Australian people often feel a lot better about ourselves when we've gone through that process and come out the other side and realised actually it didn't matter, like it didn't make us feel terrible to apologise to the stolen generations or to grant marriage equality. Do you think he's going to come up against any of that, or do you think he's just going to sit back and is he going to, another way of putting it, is he going to find guns in the GST in the way that Howard did, or is he just going to sit back and let it ride?
Look, I'll offer a caveat, but I will start by saying that he has had two very large opportunities already to change things. One was the pandemic. The pandemic offered enormous opportunities for a leader who wanted to point to deficiencies in our society and to offer changes. And they didn't have to all be revolutionary, but there were basic things. There were things like social housing. Those smaller but important opportunities haven't been grasped. And then in terms of larger, more significant opportunities like changing the nature of work, focusing more on secure work, even something you would think as electorally popular as childcare, the government just hasn't grasped those opportunities to start reshaping the world, reshaping the country in response to problems we saw arise in the pandemic. So that's a massive opportunity missed. And I think, and then the second is climate. That, of course, you could say that Scott Morrison signed up to net zero by 2050, but that is fairly meaningless. There's no plan attached. And all those people who give him credit for shepherding the coalition. He's been Prime Minister for 3 years now, and all that's really happened is the Nationals have agreed to let him. Somebody said this to me, and they're right. Have agreed to let him say net zero by 2050. That's the sole shift in the government's policy. So he has missed those two opportunities to really shift things, which suggests that it won't happen in the future. Now, there is a caveat, and the caveat is that all prime ministers in their first term have a lot of learning to do, and you can mount an argument, of course, that this is effectively Scott Morrison's first term, fair enough. But a lot of prime ministers also, at some point late in their first term, make massive shifts, and they're often the most massive shifts they make, and never have the political capital to do them again. Howard with gun laws, and with the first tranche of industrial relations changes, Hawke and Keating with deregulation of the dollar and so forth. Massive changes very early on in the terms. Perhaps, if you're being really generous, like incredibly charitable, you could say that COVID renders this term a wipeout, and if Morrison gets a second term, then that's the equivalent of other governments' first terms. But I don't believe that.
I think we've all seen prime ministers who've only been there for 3 years who've achieved a hell of a lot more.
That's true.
And had more ambition for what they could achieve. And part of the thing that, we're a policy institute, we're a think tank. I'm a bit of a policy person. That was certainly my job in politics, was thinking about policy. I sometimes, looking at the way this government operates and looking at how politics is going under the leadership of our current prime minister, that it's almost a time for an existential crisis for policy wonks who try to, are we actually going to get another wave of policy reform? Are we going to get a new agenda, another agenda? But the other thing that struck me about the pandemic, and I'll just a couple of minutes on this before we talk about the sort of news of the week, because I think that's really incisive, is that he didn't, in many respects, his response to the pandemic was either to sort of disclaim responsibility for anything, that kind of, it's not me, it's the states, it's someone else, it's someone else. It took a long time to own anything. That the economic response, on the other hand, was in many respects straight out of the playbook that effectively the Labor government, the Treasury, took in the last crisis, which was just to pump as much cash into the economy as they could possibly do in a short period of time, to use that as a way of sort of sustaining the economy. Do you think that he's learned anything out of the pandemic and the way he's handled the pandemic?
Firstly, just to go back to what you were saying about policy wonks, I think you're absolutely right. It's very sad. Whenever I talk to anybody who was a staffer in politics, they'll usually say, "No way I will ever go back." But the reason that I'm sad not to go back is that you can get an enormous amount done. You can change things in a way that's very hard to do elsewhere. And think, what are the people in there at the moment feeling about that? I mean, it must be very odd, and they will leave without that sense that you can get things done in government. But in relation to the pandemic, honestly, I don't know. There was plenty of speculation early on that he had learned from the bushfires and was putting those lessons into place during the pandemic. And I don't think that was really true. I think he learned a small aesthetic lesson about how to look like he was taking more responsibility, but that fell away pretty quickly as National Cabinet started to fragment and as he and, to some extent, Josh Frydenberg saw political mileage in attacking the states. So, look, I struggle to believe that he really learned anything during the pandemic. I don't think that spending all of that money taught the government anything in particular. I don't think that I don't think that the divide between Labor governments and Conservative governments any longer is a willingness to spend money and a desire not to spend money. The surplus debate in this country, has been dying for some time. Conservative governments are very, very free and easy with money. That is true here. It is true in the US. It is true in the UK. The austerity era passed quite quickly. The difference, and I'm not the first person to say this, the difference between the two sides in terms of money spending is what they spend the money on. That's it.
Yeah. I might come to essentially the news of the last week or the last 2 weeks, because as I was reading the book, he was doing his announcement about net zero, which seemed like a very Scott Morrison approach to a problem, is that you come up with a couple of branding opportunities and just keep repeating them. And then actually what you deliver in terms of the plan, so to speak, has very little substance and a bit of a hand-wavy magic wand. We'll invent the solution later to it. So there's that element to it, which is kind of that. But then obviously coming a cropper in at the G20 and in Glasgow with on the submarine, on the fallout of the submarines problem. I don't know if you've got any reflections as you've looked at the last week, having written this book. Obviously, the book doesn't cover these events, but I think it sends signals about what it is that it's telling us about Morrison and his government. Do you want to talk a little bit about your reflections on the last week?
Yeah. I mean, you're right. There were two elements here. On Glasgow, I think the most important thing to recognise is that even though there were a lot of attacks on Scott Morrison's so-called plan, which was obviously not a plan, and it was an absurdity. There is a sense, I think, in the media. Serious commentary is not saying this, but I think there is a sense in the media now that issue has been dealt with, and even if people don't write it like this, I think that still ties into this tendency, which I write about a lot in my book, of journalists in particular, but I think all levels of politics are guilty of this, and voters are as well to some extent, of treating politics like a game. There is this sense now that Scott Morrison has politically dealt with the issue. He's politically dealt with the issue by getting people to sign up to net zero, getting the Nats to, by coming up with these 3 slogans: the Australian way, net zero by 2050, we've got a plan, all of them completely meaningless, of course. And how is that a legitimate thing? The climate crisis remains a fact. The government hasn't done anything about it. That remains a fact. But there will be some sense now, I suspect, that the government has politically dealt with it, and that's what matters most, the politically dealing, not the substantively dealing. It's a horrible state of affairs. So that's classic Morrison, absolutely, but it also reflects a deeper problem with the way that politics is covered in this country. And, you know, a lot of voters are going to accept that now as well. So we can't duck our own complicity in that. And then you have Macron. Well, look, who knows what happened? It's clear that Morrison deceived France in certain important respects, but the difficulty, I think, around Morrison at this point is it's very hard to know when he's being deceptive and when he's not, because the thing about Morrison, I write about this in the book, is he, you know, in a non-Zen-like way, inhabits every moment completely. He is in a moment and he will do and say whatever needs to be done and said in that moment, and then he's on to the next moment. And in that next moment, he can say the opposite thing and he will believe it completely because it's what needs to be said in that moment. He has this incredible ability to convince himself that whatever he's saying is the truth. So I don't know what exactly happened between Macron and Morrison, but I am sure that if Morrison isn't telling the truth, it would look exactly the same as if he were telling the truth. And over time, I think that does become a problem for a prime minister because you start to see his words as so much flim-flam. And, you know, that is often true of Scott Morrison.
Do you think that the continual build-up of these instances of his lying or obfuscation of the truth, or the insights that things like the, you know, the Hawaii trip and the not holding a hose give us to the kind of visceral reaction to him? Do you think that's enough to pierce the persona, to show us the other side of his avatar, to start to form a different view in people's minds who Scott Morrison, the man, is, compared with the image that he presented and that people accepted? Do you think that's going to change things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is already changing. It's already changed. You talk to pollsters and they will tell you that people don't have to be reminded. They don't have to be prompted in any way. People are very skeptical about Scott Morrison already. But this comes back to the point I made earlier about whether people are angry at him or not. So with things like lying in politics, I think people can become skeptical of a certain politician, but they only really round on somebody when that person's failings are tied to consequences, especially when that person's a prime minister. When you're an opposition leader, it's a bit different. And that was, you know, so for Bill Shorten, for example, you're having to climb a higher mountain as opposition leader than you are as prime minister. So the slightest element of distrust can hurt you. But with a prime minister, people are more happy to stick with the status quo. So the question then becomes, is it causing any problems for them that you have a shaky relationship to the truth, or that you're a marketing man? And I'm not 100% sure that people are convinced that there are consequences yet. Now, the incidents on the international stage can start to head in that direction. They can start to give people a sense that in a time of instability, in a time of great and rapid global change, that this particular person doesn't actually have what it takes to steer Australia safely through those times. I think that can be a problem for a prime minister. I think this week could have nudged Scott Morrison a little bit closer to that point, but there's a little way to go.
Which is a good point to sort of cast forward. Think about the next election. There's going to be one in the next 6 months, you would think. You know, don't imagine that Scott Morrison's had the experience of the last week that would force him to come back and call a snap election for December. So definitely looks like 2022 is when it's going to be. How much of the next election do you think is going to be being shaped by the experiences we've had during the pandemic? How much do you think we're going to forget it? Do you think he's got the ability to do a reset and an agenda shift going into the next election? Just a bit of discussion on your observations of him, your observations of politics, and what you think the new year and the next election will bring.
I mean, the first thing to say is I have no idea. I think COVID is a really, really odd time. There are you would normally have a long lead up to an election and a sense of things shifting and cogs grinding into gear. But this election is going to be upon us very suddenly, really, and probably at some point after summer, whether it's March or May, it will land very suddenly, and it'll be a very strange thing, I think. So, look, I think he can reset things, and that partly comes from this ability of his to be in the moment and that moment alone. I think he can draw a line under what has happened previously and convince the rest of the country to do a bit of that as well. And I think the country will be ready for that. I mean, I've been saying for a long time that I think whichever party wins, but either party has to move on from the pandemic. This is going to be largely, I think, a post-pandemic election. The pandemic, of course, has created certain impressions in people's mind. Certainly, as I say, Morrison has sustained a lot of character damage during the pandemic, but we are all sick to death of talking about COVID. So unless there is a massive resurgence in case numbers and a return to lockdowns, possible, of course, but unless that happens, no, I think we are going to be looking to the future. Now, ordinarily, the future is Labor's terrain. That's how Labor wins elections. They make it about the future versus the past. I don't think Labor is really playing in that territory yet. And so I think Morrison is moving towards claiming the future. I don't know whether he's succeeded yet, but with his talk about submarines, even with net zero, he is clearly shifting to that frame. And Scott Morrison makes a lot of political errors, but at that kind of broad strategic level, what do I want the election issue to be? I think he is a solid thinker on that. So I think, watch what he's doing in that space.
A great question we had from a contributor before the event, who asks, what do you think Morrison fears? Every game player knows their own weaknesses. What do you think he thinks his is?
I think that Scott Morrison has a deep fear, genuinely, a deep aversion to being blamed for things. Every time that somebody tries to hang something on him, he begins by obfuscating, then he finds somebody else to blame. If he is eventually forced to apologise, he very rarely apologises on behalf of himself. He normally loops in a few other people. I'm sorry. All of us involved in this are sorry. Everybody involved in the aged care process is sorry. As with many things politicians do, you can dismiss that as a manipulative political tactic if you like, but it is so consistent as to suggest to me that he genuinely fears blame. He fears being blamed for things, and that's when he gets most defensive.
And what do you think we can do about the political culture in the country? You've critiqued that. What do you think we need to do to kind of make it a better politics?
I mean, really big question, very good question. And the responsibilities on different groups of people here. I think a politician will come along at some point who sees the value in telling the truth, not because it's a political advantage, but because it has value in itself, and who wants to pursue policy because that's a good and useful thing to do, not because those policies are what need to be done to hew to a particular path through the political minefield. So that's a political level. You actually need political leaders who remember what politics is supposed to be about and not what it's become about. Then you need journalists, and some journalists do this very admirably. You need journalists who are focused on the substance of political debate and don't feel, political objectivity, journalistic objectivity is a very complex thing, and in some respects it's very important, but it doesn't mean that you say, he said, she said, they said. It has to mean you actually look at the merits of what people are saying and try to report the facts. And I think journalism has moved too far away from that, as it has become obsessed with politics as a game, as a horse race as well. And then finally, you need the voters. And that means everybody beginning to pay attention to the type of country that our politicians are arguing we should become. That is what any prime minister or prime ministerial candidate is ultimately arguing, whether they're holding themselves out or whether they're arguing for policies, they are putting forward a vision of Australia. And I'm not sure that we think of it in those terms often enough. You know, as the novelist James Coetzee said, the last election was decided on arcane matters in the tax code, you know, franking credits and whatnot. I mean, that is a piddling way to decide an election.
It was, but it was what it was decided on. I think you're absolutely right about the pivot to the future and the conversation, the political conversation that we're going to be having in Australia at the beginning of 2022, I think is going to be very, very different to the one we're having today or the one we were having a couple of months ago. I think it's going to set up a fascinating contest for ideas, for policy, for politics, and for the future of the country in the next year and beyond. I'm conscious of time. You've been very generous with yours. We've had fantastic attendance and a fantastic feedback, and a lot of questions have come through. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. But Sean, thank you so much for coming along today and sharing your thoughts. It's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. It's been great catching up with you again. For everyone who has joined us and has not yet bought the book, please go and do so. It is legitimately a very, very good book, both insightful, incisive, but most importantly, it's actually a pleasure to read. It shows what a great and gifted writer Sean is. So congratulations, Sean, for that. For those of you who are interested in making sure you kept up to date with things that are happening at the McKell Institute, what our next series of digital and in-person events as we shift back to doing things in the room with people again. I'm not sure I'm ready for that yet, but we certainly will be having some in-person events soon right across Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. Please make sure you're signed up to our email list to keep up to date with the latest that we're producing here. Sean, thank you once again. We hope to do something, maybe we'll do something with you in person in Melbourne next year in a sort of a bit of an election preview mode. So thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, for coming, and we'll talk to you soon.